Hi there, and welcome to Next Frontier. My name is Thomas Anderson, founder and CEO of Responsibly, and Next Frontier is my show about sustainability in the supply chain. Today I'm talking to Thomas Johnsen. Thomas is the first professor we've ever had on the show. He's been studying supply chains for the past 30 years, specializing in sustainable procurement for the last decade or so. So today we'll explore what's being studied in academia and how insights from academia can be applied to the real world. We'll talk about procurement's role in the sustainability transformation. We'll talk about trust and power dynamics between buyers and suppliers. We'll talk about the trickiness of sub-tier supply chains and how the compliance landscape is evolving. In fact, we recorded this just after Omnibus was announced, so a little bit of commentary on that as well. Lots of refreshing perspectives in this one. Okay, Thomas Johnsen, Professor of Procurement and Supply Management at Audencia Business School, Visiting Professor of Sustainable Procurement at Copenhagen Business School, and Associate Editor at the Journal of Purchasing and Supply Management. Here we go. Good morning, Thomas.
Morning. Just getting my lights ready here.
Yes, fantastic. It looks sunny on your end.
Yes, very nice weather actually. Spring is arriving.
Amazing. Yeah, spring is arriving. We're finally getting there.
A bit cold
I think
in the
our
morning,
entire
but, yeah.
office has been sick on and off for the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
So I'm also really hoping that we are getting out of that period very soon.
Good. I hope you're recovered. Is the light and sound okay? I didn't manage to find a pair of headphones, so I hope the sound will be all right.
Yeah, I think this is perfect, Thomas.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
That's amazing. How are you doing?
Yeah.
How's everything going?
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Good.
How did the whole omnibus announcements last week affect academia?
I don't know if it has particularly affected academia. We don't react that quickly. But yeah, surely for those of us who work on sustainable procurement, sustainable supply chain management, it's bound to have an effect on our discussions with the students and also for the research, of course. So I've been telling my students for the last last couple of years that stricter regulations are coming. And I think the last couple of lectures I have given as well on sustainable procurement, where I've had the chance also to talk about the impact of drivers and motivations for companies to engage in sustainable procurement. I've talked about recent changes towards stricter requirements for due diligence, how it affects the need for companies to actually monitor suppliers, not only their first tier or direct suppliers, but also their indirect or sub-tier suppliers. And yeah, talking about those companies that are in scope as well, requirements we're looking quite strict, and now of course we basically have to revisit and discuss the implications of those changes.
Yeah, 100%. What's your gut feel? Is it deregulation or is it simplification that's going on right now?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. I think there's a political drive globally to try to reduce regulations following in the footsteps of what's happening in the US. So for Europe to remain competitive, clearly there are pressures to both simplify regulations, because we know that within the European Union, companies are subject to a lot of regulations, and certainly those for due diligence requirements and the whole wider EU taxonomy, etc., as part of the EU Green Deal, of course, provide a lot of or put a lot of pressure on companies that are in scope. So for them to try to, for Europe not least, to try to keep up with what's happening globally, to remain competitive. I think what is seen very often as unnecessary bureaucracy. Everything that comes under this, all the sustainable procurement requirements and regulations is all part of that picture, isn't it? So,
100%. It is. It's at the very least, it's an interesting field to be a part of. There's no boring month, so to say. There's always stuff happening. So we'll probably get back to Omnibus here and there in the different things that we talk about today, Thomas. But I also just wanted to give you a big welcome to Next Frontier, and thank you so much for coming on the show.
You're very welcome, Thomas.
I've really been looking forward to this one because, as we've also talked about a few times, we've never had a professor on the show. So I'm really looking forward to just kind of getting the opportunity to pick your brain on, what's actually being studied in academia when it comes to sustainable procurement. But before we get into some of those, more kind of complicated topics, I want to go a little bit on your background, Thomas, because you've basically been researching and teaching procurement, supply chain management your entire life, and then at the later part of the career focusing specifically a lot on sustainable procurement, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, a little bit about my background, first of all. So I am Danish like you, Thomas. So I also have certain links to academia and industry in Denmark, but I have worked for the last several years in France at a business school called Audencia Business School, which is in the city of Nantes. And I have also worked elsewhere in Europe. I spent many years working in the UK. I took my PhD in the UK at the University of Bath, for example, many years ago now. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I have dedicated my professional life to researching and teaching in procurement very widely. We used to talk about procurement using purchasing, really, but I think there's a consensus now that what we understand as procurement covers the more strategic aspects of purchasing. It's a wider discussion there anyway, as well as supply chain management. And yeah, in recent years, a lot of my work has focused on sustainability, many different themes on sustainable procurement as well as sustainable supply chain management. Yeah.
Fantastic. What led you there, Thomas? Why did you, of the whole procurement landscape and kind of supply chain management landscape, which is exciting these days, in many ways, right? Because we have the global instability, and that puts a lot of focus on the supply chain, like from COVID to the boat turning around in the Suez Canal and blocking that. Like, there's a lot of exciting things that are happening in the supply chain these days, right?
Yeah.
So what made sustainability a topic that you kind of wanted to zoom in on and study?
Well, as I said, I have worked on procurement in general, focusing on a number of different themes: supplier relationship management, supplier partnerships, supply networks, how companies can innovate in collaboration with their suppliers. A lot of my work has traditionally focused on what we call early supplier involvement in product development and innovation. But I would say around 15 years ago, coincided actually with my move to France. But I would say around then I started to realize that sustainability was becoming such a big challenge, but also a big opportunity, both for companies, for industry, as well as for us as academics, as researchers and educators. And I wouldn't, I like to tell my students that I'm not someone who has, ever since a young age, focused a lot on sustainability or being green, etc. But of course, like so many other people, I find myself also being increasingly worried about what's happening in terms of sustainability, whether we're talking about the environmental side of it, with global warming, with emissions, with pollution, plastic pollution, whatever, or also all the social aspects of sustainability. Traditionally when we talk about procurement, the single biggest KPI has always been savings. It's been about cost. And of course, this is something that has driven companies to outsource, particularly to outsource to low-cost countries, to low-cost areas. And although sustainability cannot be just purely linked to that trend, we have seen that a lot of the risks in supply chains stem from supply chains or supply networks being very long, being very complex, and being associated with a lot of risks. Of course, a lot of these risks, you mentioned also the container ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, of course. These are, the kind of operational supply chain risks that we talk a lot about as well. But sustainability risks as well. Sustainability is fundamentally a risk for companies that very often take place within their supply chain. So the longer they are, the more complex, the lack of visibility that companies have over their supply chains, particularly when they span continents, of course, is a big issue. So I when I got into in my work, really focusing a lot of it on sustainable procurement and sustainable supply chain, is really in response to all of these changes, and really, not just trying to engage in that rapidly developing field, but also to take some kind of intellectual leadership, like many colleagues.
Amazing, Thomas. Super cool. Let's extend on that a little bit. I want you to help me get an overview a little bit of what does academia study when it comes to sustainable procurement. You talked a little bit about risk, but can you help me kind of break it down? What are the different topics that are being looked into in academia when it comes to sustainable procurement specifically?
Well, first of all, let me start by saying that if we look at research into both procurement but supply chain management as well, two very closely connected fields, of course, sustainability has been probably the biggest growth area the last 10, 15 years. If we look at the number of publications, which is the currency that we're working with within academia, is publications that document the research that we're doing. The research on sustainable procurement, sustainable supply chain management has been really strong, has really experienced an upsurge. Various other themes coming along as well, not least digital, of course, in the last few years. But there's a whole range of different themes within sustainable procurement. So some of it, and reflecting my own research, is about the monitoring. How can companies control for compliance within their supply chains? Both, and a lot of the research initially looked at direct supplier relationships, so relationships with the first tier, essentially, and the various ways in which companies could ensure that those suppliers comply, so there's no violation, whether we talk about the environmental or social sustainability compliance. Increasingly, research has also focused on the extended supply chains, or what I would call supply networks, because, as I mentioned, it's very often the case that the non-compliance takes place in the distant sub-tier supply network. So, it might be a third-tier supplier or a fourth-tier supplier or whatever, where a company will find that there's a supplier they didn't even realize that they were connected to, but stories in the media have come up, or there's been an exposure by an NGO or whatever to say there's child labor being used, or there's pollution on a massive scale by that supplier, or whatever non-compliance incident that is found. From a research point of view, that presents some particular methodological challenges in particular, because it's very difficult to collect data as companies get bombarded by people like me, by researchers, as well as students, of course, who want to speak to them, to conduct interviews, and for us as researchers to really look into these kind of multi-tier supply network issues requires insights from beyond what we would call the focal companies, so an assembling companies, assembly company, but also to actually hear it from the supplier side. So, for example, a lot of my research traditionally has focused on multi-tier data collection. So speaking to people in the procurement department within one company, but then actually going to some of their first-tier suppliers, and then ideally also persuading those suppliers to let us get into their suppliers and so forth in turn. So I would, the whole monitoring for compliance has certainly been one theme of a lot of research. But these days, of course, sustainable procurement covers a range of different themes. So also research on increasingly on circular procurement, circular supply chains, circular economy, etc., etc. Research also looking into, should we say, the sustainability of sustainability as a concept. So there's critical discussion of whether being sustainable is enough. Should companies try not just to reduce the harm that they do, basically, or should they really try to be even more ambitious? So some of the recent research, for example, is looking into regenerative supply chains, as well as, of course, the circularity principles and so forth. And then I would say, again, these are some of the research themes that also relate to my own research, but really there's so much research going into sustainable procurement. These days, the problem is, as ever, getting visibility of our research in the business world, which doesn't always happen.
100%. That's fascinating. And you've highlighted a lot of issues there that are super complex and interesting that I want to dive a little bit more into. So we'll talk a little bit more about sub-tier supply chains a bit later, because there's a lot to touch upon there, and also some changes, of course, with the legislation. So I want to kind of hear your thoughts on that. You also talked a little bit about, how do you actually make suppliers comply with issues? And I think that's also, a huge focal point with our customers. One thing is identifying issues, but how do you actually do something about it? So I want to reserve some time there. Maybe we even have time to go into circularity, but that might be a little bit ambitious, but that's also fascinating. But before we go into all of that, Thomas, the last thing you said, I think is really interesting, right? The definition of what is sustainable procurement actually, because we are talking about it in a variety of different ways. You mentioned risk in the beginning. We talk about compliance. Then we talk about kind of impact. Can you help me understand that a little bit better? What is sustainable procurement actually, and why do we think procurement has anything to say when it comes to sustainability?
Well, in terms of definition, first of all, I would define sustainable procurement as a consideration of not only the economic factors in any procurement decision, in any procurement process, but also environmental and social factors, sustainability. So typically when companies make procurement decisions, cost, the economic factors are the dominant drivers. Of course, other operational factors also come into procurement decisions. So supply risk factors, quality of product or service that you're buying, the service levels that suppliers can provide, etc., etc. But sustainable procurement really adds that the importance of considering environmental and social factors as part of the procurement decisions, and that would include all decisions related to sourcing, so supplier selection and evaluation, for example. So suppliers are selected not only on the basis of KPIs that reflect the economic and operational factors, but also very much sustainability, but also other wider procurement decisions. I mean, a lot of if we look at, for example, going back to your questions about how can companies ensure that the suppliers comply, we can look at the role of contracts, having contracts, having codes of conduct in place, having agreements with suppliers that they sign up to ensure that they will comply with your expectations, your policies as a company, as well as fundamentally acting legally, of course. But a lot of research also in procurement traditionally, as well as supply chain management, has looked at relationship factors as well. So looked at relationships between buyers and suppliers. So we look at the role of trust. We look at the role of power and dependence. Power and dependence traditionally being very important from the point of view of making sourcing decisions, making relationship decisions with companies to avoid that you don't get overly dependent on any one supplier, particularly when you live in a very uncertain world. These factors have kind of risen to the surface again, because for many years companies were really going down the road where they were pursuing very close partnerships with suppliers, and sometimes using single sourcing or what we might call sole sourcing arrangements with suppliers to really encourage a lot of collaboration with those suppliers, which is very sound practice. But it also exposes companies to risk if anything happens to that supplier. We only have to look at the COVID-19 crisis as well as other disruptions to the world economy to realize that. So yeah, a lot of research has gone into looking at these kind of relationship factors between buyers and suppliers, and research is then looking at what is the impact of, for example, power with a company. So if you are a large company, and most importantly, if you're relatively large in relationship to your suppliers, if you have asymmetric relationships with your suppliers where you're in the driving seat, of course you can impose your requirements for sustainability because suppliers will have little choice. But for many other companies, we can't assume that companies are those in the driving seats in the relation to their suppliers. A lot of the time, the suppliers can be bigger, and the dependency balance can be in favor of the suppliers, and therefore it doesn't make sense, or companies are simply not in a position where they can just impose those conditions on suppliers. And in that case, companies will have to look at other ways of getting their messages across. Collaborative practices, for example, teaming up with other companies in their industry who are looking to achieve the same goal, for example. Giving rise, of course, also to the whole way of working through platforms, shared platforms.
Super interesting. So, and this is something that, doesn't just belong to sustainability, right? We've seen it classic procurement practices for a long time, also when it comes to negotiation and cost, and it's all about leverage, right? And there's a bunch of techniques to segment your suppliers according to where you have that leverage, and, different tactics for different supplier segmentations and stuff like that. Are there any, do you have a favorite approach of saying, for any company, how do they take a look at their supply chain and find out what to do for different segments of it?
Yeah, I mean, although there have been a lot of developments, particularly on the digital side in recent years, companies still rely on some of the basic tools and models for procurement and for sourcing. So one of them divides suppliers into levels of cost, basically, as well as supply risk or supply chain risk, if you like, giving rise to fundamentally 4 different types of suppliers. There's a very well-known matrix known as the Kraljic matrix, which does this, and a number of different variations on that. But it's fundamentally using those 2 dimensions of cost and supply risk, and that gives rise to fundamentally 4 different types of buying situations. So non-critical, so companies are buying low cost, low risk items. The opposite, strategic items, very critical, high cost, very difficult to source, very few supplier alternatives, where you typically develop collaborative relationships, and then situations that we would know as a leverage and bottleneck buying situations and suppliers. And of course, that also then hints at those situations where it can be more challenging for a company to ensure compliance amongst their suppliers, because where they're in a situation where, again, they have the power, because they have relatively low level of supply risk, because there might be many alternative suppliers. So again, if you're buying some kind of commodity, many different suppliers can do it. So if one supplier doesn't comply, well, you go somewhere else. Whereas if you're in a high risk scenario where you have very few available suppliers, whether they represent relatively low cost or financial impact, or a high level, you don't have a lot of alternatives, and therefore the approach needs to be different to how you can ensure compliance with those suppliers.
Super interesting. That makes a ton of sense, and I think it leads to one of my next question, which is, back to the definition of sustainable procurement. There are different things we can optimize for, right? There's the topics that are easy to convince, let's say, a CFO about, right? Reputational risk management, compliance, and avoiding getting fines, and those kind of things. And then there are the topics that are more impact driven, actually making positive changes, not just to be compliant or to minimize a reputational risk, but making positive changes. And here, there can be a skepticism sometimes in terms of how much power do we actually have in procurement. And I guess some of it is related to how we segment our suppliers. Some of it is related to, does it actually make a difference if somebody signs on a code of conduct? Does that signature mean anything? And so on and so forth. Beyond the segmentation part, does academia say anything about what impact can we have in the supply chain?
Well, yeah, and very, very interesting question, and it also touches on an earlier question that you were asking about what is the role of procurement? Because of course we should remember that although procurement has a natural interface with suppliers, with supply chains, procurement is by no means the only function in a company that deals with suppliers. And when it comes to a lot of the sourcing decisions, for example, procurement should have the lead. They should have at least influence, but it's not always procurement that takes decisions over which suppliers get selected, where do the sourcing decisions go. So as you mentioned, the CFO, the finance department would very often have a strong influence. Could be from a cost perspective. Say research and development, R&D, can also very often have influence over sourcing decisions. And then it depends really on what you're buying. So in addition to the model that I was just referring to for classification of suppliers, we should also remember that companies, if we look at the wide range of categories, some of them are what we would call direct items, direct procurement. So everything that goes into the production or at least value creation process in a company. So material suppliers for a manufacturing company or components, etc. But companies are also buying lots of services, for example, or a lot of, say logistic services, marketing services, catering services, cleaning services, a lot of purchase categories that can sometimes be managed by other functions, and where it can be very difficult for procurement to get any kind of impact over purchase over the purchase decisions. So anyway, you were asking also about definition of sustainability and what are we really trying to achieve? So fundamentally, I do think the risk ambition is most important, and of course that is hugely driven by regulations because it's about acting legally. But we shouldn't forget, and that goes back into our discussion right at the beginning about the recent regulatory changes in Europe, that there are other drivers or motivations for companies to decide to go down the sustainability route, including sustainable procurement. So increasingly we have customers, whether we're talking about end consumers or we're talking about business to business customers, that put pressure on companies, including suppliers, to demonstrate that they make efforts, that they perform due diligence to ensure that their supply chain is in compliance. So typically we see companies receiving a large number of questionnaires, what's known as self-assessment questionnaires, structured around some of the well-known standards, Global Reporting Initiative, or whatever, to ask companies to say, do you do this, do you do that, and so forth. So companies are certainly under pressure from their customers, including their business-to-business customers, which of course can translate or transfer requirements from end consumers down the supply chain. But we also see, of course, pressures from other quarters. NGOs can be on the lookout for their particular sphere of interest, whether we're talking about an NGO dedicated to an environmental cause or, say, human modern slavery, for example, or other labor issues. NGOs will, like newspaper journalists, they will very happily go into suppliers to try to find out what's actually what's actually going on there, and any kind of news story coming out like that about a company, about a company's suppliers, it's bad news, of course, for any company that competes on a brand. It's damaging, of course, for a company that prides itself of being, a company that is well known for its quality, for its ethical ways of doing business and so forth. To have this kind of exposure is bad news. And then if I can just mention one thing as well, and that is that I do think a lot of companies have leaders, have top management teams where they have their own vision, their own ambition to try to have a positive impact on not just their company and their shareholders, but the world around them. To try to not destroy the world around them, contributing to depleting natural resources or pollution, etc. For a lot of leaders in companies, I think they want to do good, and I think fortunately that can be despite changes in politics and regulation that I think a lot of companies and maybe it's a wishful thinking here from my part, but although we see some companies that I think will reduce their focus on sustainability, a lot of companies have made those commitments and will, I think, demonstrate their long-term commitment. Again, also in reflection on their shareholders, maybe, but certainly their wider stakeholders as well.
100%. And I think in many ways it makes a lot of sense. The supply chain is not something separate from your operations, right? The supply chain only exists because you are outside sourcing work basically to someone else. So it should be within your responsibility as well. It's been traditionally very hard. It's becoming easier, but it should be within your responsibility. But if we go back to the impact angle, so there's some big numbers out there, like it's starting to get a little bit old, but CDP at some point said that 40% of global emissions are directly or indirectly impacted by procurement, for example.
Yeah.
I would love to get your take on numbers like that. And is that something that academia has been studying as well? How much change is being affected when we see, one of these big corporates really launching a hard sustainable procurement program?
Well, we in procurement, we have traditionally pointed to the importance of procurement on the basis of the value being created within a company's supply chain. So if we look at in any industry, we need to understand manufacturing in particular from the point of view of the outsourcing trend, and not just as I mentioned earlier about using suppliers in low cost areas, but outsourcing more widely. Companies for years have outsourced anything they don't perceive as core competence. So the proportion of value very often that stems from a company's supply chain can be easily up to 80%. Look at automotive industry, for example. We might see, say, 60 to 80% of the value creation stemming from its suppliers, more widely, different tiers. And that also means that if we look at something like emissions, we divide into scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. The scope 3 emissions are those that are, of course, very difficult to tackle because they're not within your own company, but it's also where the majority of the emissions tend to be and therefore need to be reduced. And that's, it's everything to do with, of course, all the production activities in the supply chain, but also to do with logistics and transport and so forth. That again, particularly when you have supply chains that are spread geographically as well, that's very much part of the picture. So if companies really are to tackle emissions in particular, then again, just as a very rough figure, 60 to 80% can very often stem from a company's supply chain. So whether that's cost or whether we're looking at that from an emissions point of view, and that you were asking me about research that looks into this. So I would say that's probably more on the supply chain research rather than procurement research, although the two can be difficult to separate. But there's a lot of research, of course, going into that issue now about how companies can not only analyze and measure their emissions impacts across supply chains, but also how can they engage suppliers, how can they mobilize suppliers in reducing these emissions.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. And so, Thomas, let's say that we've identified the suppliers in our supply chain where, there's a lot of materiality around sustainability. So we know that we should be doing something to be compliant for risk, for impact, those kind of things. Maybe we've even done a segmentation, using stuff like the project matrix to find out here we can actually have an impact. We talked a little bit about trust and contracts, but can you help me kind of expand on what are the best practices that are being studied in terms of how do we then ensure compliance, impact, those kind of things, once we've kind of defined who we want to work with?
Yeah, so if we look first of all at various monitoring practices, so monitoring of your suppliers is really the first step to make sure that suppliers comply. So it's a control measure. So I was talking about the self-assessment questionnaires that companies have traditionally used, and traditionally the approach has been companies will individually design a questionnaire and send out to suppliers, and then suppliers get bombarded from 50 different customers, companies with more or less identical questionnaires. A lot of waste, of course, in that process. It's not very lean. But in addition to that, of course, there's also audits of suppliers. A lot of debate about the effectiveness of audits. Audits, of course, require more resource, time and money, expertise than sending out a questionnaire, quite obviously. But audits will typically be used in order to follow up on some red flags from questionnaires. But all audits, like questionnaires, are also imperfect, of course, because suppliers that don't comply may not be honest in coming forward with any non-compliance examples. So whether they, are using, if they have employees, have workers that don't have a contract, for example, or don't get paid the minimum wage, or whether they have employees working at minimum wage formally, but then have deductions that will bring them below that. These are all things that make it very challenging for companies to really find out what's going on. The assessment questionnaires, the audits are typically key activities for supplier monitoring. But then, of course, there's a whole following up as well, all the rectifying actions. And where we see best practices there, I would say, is those companies that really have a systematic approach to follow up on non-compliance incidents, helping suppliers to understand why this is an important issue, and ideally also providing training for suppliers, for supplier personnel, so you don't just need to provide training of your own in-house procurement people, for example, to be able to carry out these activities. Very often in collaboration, of course, with a sustainability department or whatever they're called in the company. But you also need to ideally train your suppliers to develop their capabilities, just like companies have done traditionally with supply development programs that have, for example, help suppliers to develop lean manufacturing techniques or quality management, etc., etc. So I would say that's these are key practices. If I can mention one more, because this is very much linked to monitoring and to risk, but I would say another area is really collaboration with key suppliers around the development of new eco solutions, whether we're talking about, say, the development of green products or green packaging to eliminate toxic materials or material or component which is impossible to recycle, for example, or repair, and so on. These kind of joint projects with suppliers are also important. Of course, involving the R&D, the technical people within a company, but also should involve procurement as well, because again, they really have that interface with the suppliers that they can help facilitate collaboration with suppliers.
Amazing, Thomas. Super interesting. And it reminds me of something I talked with a procurement consultant about once, where he was like, best practices in sustainable procurement are very similar to best practices in just regular procurement practices, right?
Yes.
How do you kind of collaborate, innovate together with them, those kind of things? That's fascinating. Yeah. Thomas, I want to see if we can touch a little bit upon sub-tier supply chains as well, because it's a huge pain point for companies. It's also something that now the Omnibus announced that CSDDD no longer has a requirement for, sub-tier suppliers and so on. So 5 years ago, it was huge with blockchains. Now nobody's talking about blockchains for networks and so on. How are you experiencing kind of, this whole complexity around sub-tier supply chain, different efforts towards conquering it? What works, what doesn't work? What's kind of your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I would say that in my work, I've looked a lot at the use of what we would call cascade strategies to reach into sub-tier suppliers. So the communication of clear expectation of your first tier, that these are your expectations for the first tier, that these are the policies, don't accept non-compliance in these kind of areas, and that they must communicate these requirements with their own suppliers. Cascading, filtering down to the second tier that way, and from there on, of course, ideally into the entire extended supply networks, third tier, fourth tier, and so forth. So the cascade strategies are something that we find a lot in different industries. I've been doing quite a lot of work with the fashion industry recently, and looking at the issue of animal welfare. A lot of research, of course, looks at the welfare of labourers, conditions, fair conditions for labourers, and so forth, in addition to pollution issues from the fashion industry. But a lot of fashion industry also involves the use of what we would call animal-derived materials, fur, for example, controversial, but other animal-derived materials. So a lot of companies in the fashion industry are also trying to find alternatives to an animal-derived material, synthetic material, and so on, which from a performance point of view can make sense. So they're using these cascade strategies is what we have found the best fashion companies are using, really having clear codes of conduct, for example, that specify as our first tier supplier, we expect you to do this with your suppliers in turn. That's interesting also from a research point of view as well as an ethical point of view, because this is an area that hasn't been researched so much. So of course that's what research fundamentally is about as well, is to find something new and exciting of relevance. The other thing I would mention, the other practice is intervention, direct intervention in a company's supply chain. So again, as you mentioned very correctly, in my view, this isn't just specific to sustainability. A traditional practice, if a company has a sub-tier supplier that has a problem, so it could be quality issue, delivery issue, or sustainability incident, a company can choose to go straight into that supplier to conduct an audit or to help it to change for example,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of, intervening or circumventing the intermediate suppliers in turn. And then, of course, in addition to this, all the new developments around collaborative approaches, about platforms, I think are very exciting here because, again, for any single company to do this, whether we're talking about activities like audits, but going into sub-tier and so on, it's not in the interest of any companies. You know, the vast majority of companies out there across industries, they want to eliminate this. They want to make sure their suppliers act in a sustainable way, in an ethical way. So it makes a lot of sense to collaborate. So in industry-wide initiatives to join forces, I think that these are really interesting developments. And of course, I mean, you mentioned blockchain. I would agree. I think blockchain is receiving a little bit less attention. Although I still think that, you know, there's clearly a lot of potential there. We do see companies, for example, in fashion industry, some interesting example. But in some ways, I think artificial intelligence has kind of stolen the thunder from blockchain, because artificial intelligence, of course, also offers these kind of possibilities for a company to, and very, very often in collaboration, to collect huge amounts of data in a very efficient way that play a very important role in sustainability analysis and compliance.
100%. And I think, and maybe we're just with blockchains, by the way, we're just at that part of the hype cycle where, you know, we always end up, and where we will end up with AI as well, right? It booms in discussions, and then reality hits, and then it kind of slowly becomes practical. But I think it's still, like, the way I see it, we need to be careful that we don't mix too many problems together. So, you know, when you're talking about cascading and so on, like, the fundamental problem there is really, how do we identify who the entities are in that chain? Once we've identified them, then we can analyze them. And there it might be difficult to get everybody, all of the actors in the industry aligned, because different companies might be looking at different things. So when I see kind of the industry initiatives trying to combine these things, where they both want to collaborate on identifying and on assessing, I think that becomes a little bit dangerous, because then it stalls due to disagreement. So I have some thoughts about maybe splitting it up and these kind of things. And then you have trading data. Is that something that you guys have ever studied, where you can simply see in some of these import-export databases, when goods crosses borders, you can see who supplies them, who imports them. You're not reliant on getting a supplier to actually sit down and say, hey, these are my 10 suppliers, right? Because it will be logged in a journal somewhere.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question there. And at least a couple of issues I'm thinking of here. One is that I do think that, you know, I've talked in terms of how companies can monitor their suppliers, and traditionally the rules of directly collecting information from the suppliers. But of course, ideally, companies should triangulate by collecting information with different methods from different sources, and increasingly that's also about using documentary data. So whether that's from industry reports or actual trading data, or whatever, I think the combining these different sources of data is very important. So this is, of course, also some things that can be done via blockchain, via artificial intelligence. And I would say, you know, the other thing I was thinking here is that from a research point of view, I talked about my own research, relying traditionally on interviewing. I like to actually speak to people in companies, grill them on their answers. But increasingly also we see the use of documentary analysis. So researchers will rely on analysis of database information, for example, whether that's for the purpose of sustainable supply chain analysis or anything else. But documentary analysis is certainly where we have seen a lot of development in recent times.
Amazing. Thomas, this has been absolutely fascinating. Are there any last words you want to leave listeners with on how to get started on a sustainable procurement journey?
That's a tricky one. I think not trying to be perfect from the start, to start internally with discussions about what you want and why you should do it. That can then impact on how you go about it. And then just start little by little, and not try to do everything on your own as well. To collaborate with whatever stakeholders that you might find. So there are some very nice developments, I would say. Also, professional networks. So if I can mention one, I would mention the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, which has grown enormously since it started just a few years ago, where they've run lots of seminars and workshops and different chapters in different countries as well, subdivisions where they engage in trying to discuss how can we go about this and so on. So I would say my advice would be don't try to do everything on your own. Try to discuss with your peers, with other people who want to try and do the same thing.
Fantastic. Great advice to leave it on, Thomas. Thomas, I think that's all we have time for, but this was absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much for coming on Next Frontier today.
Thanks for inviting me, Thomas.
If you're still here, then first of all, thank you so much for listening. If you've got thoughts about this episode or what you'd like to hear more of, you can email us at thomas@nextfrontier.earth. We really do read every email. You can also hit me up directly on LinkedIn. Just search for Thomas Buch Andersen. That's Thomas B-U-C-H Andersen. If you feel like it, please share with your friends and subscribe wherever you listen to our podcast. We also have a YouTube channel. It's on @NextFrontierEarth if you want to see what we actually look like in person. And if you really love the show, hit us with that 5-star review. Today's episode was produced and edited by Christina Sotu, and Next Frontier music is by Keyhole. See you next time.